With the exception of a very few warm days here and there, it's been a fairly cool spring so far, which isn't such a bad thing since we all know, in this country at least, that once the heat sets in, it can last for weeks, if not months. And that means adjusting to the new climatic conditions, including the right diet. A classic in Spanish summertime fare is gazpacho, a refreshing vegetable soup made mainly with tomatoes. It often generally includes peppers and cucumbers and garlic and olive oil, vinegar, and a pinch of salt, something like a salad milkshake. There are few recipes in Spanish cuisine as personal and as international as gazpacho, Andalusian-style gazpacho. This famous, creamy, cold vegetable-based soup is one of the trademarks of this country's vast gastronomic offer, praised by culinary professionals around the world. It apparently isn't to everyone's liking. In a recent Fluff article about the best and worst of international cuisine, the author dismissed the gazpacho as just an upscale name for tomato soup. Yes, I said to myself, you're right, and maybe a Tesla is simply a golf cart on steroids. I do believe the writer may need to consider a career change, but who knows, there may be an explanation for the confusion. You see, back home in the United States, a man named W.G. Peacock came up in 1933 with his own version of this horticultural smoothie, known today as V8. As the name suggests, 8 vegetables were mercilessly liquefied into a watery soup. Then the creator added some spice and a generous dose of sodium to give it flavor. Mr. Peacock originally called it Vegemin 8, but then cleverly shortened it to V8 because it sounded snappier and the consumer would immediately associate it with a powerful, invigorating 8-cylinder car engine. So that was pretty good thinking. And then, later on, the Campbell's Soup Company bought it out, fully understanding the potential of the product. They have apparently remained faithful to the original recipe ever since, marketing the blend of juices as the ideal meal for vegans on the run and referring to it as a self-styled gazpacho, if you want to get fancy, quote unquote. So even though that statement itself makes a nice reference to gazpacho, such a claim would raise more than a few eyebrows here in Spain, then maybe some laughter, and then finally a fist coming down hard on a table with disdain. You simply don't mess with gazpacho. A V8 might beat waffle fries and triple patty cheeseburgers if avoiding a cardiovascular breakdown is your thing, but trust me, it ain't the same. Gazpacho must be one of the world's easiest dishes to whip up and yet the trickiest to get right or to satisfy. I'll be darned if I can find 2 Spaniards who will agree on what the perfect gazpacho is. They may not even share the same opinion of one particular version. The ingredients are basically the same no matter what you do, but no one can agree on which ones to use and which ones to leave out. And here's one of the biggest issues: how much of each. Differences can lead to disputes, which in turn can move on to heated debates, with each side obstinately defending their point of view. As a rule of thumb, your average Spaniard's reference of excellence is the version that their mom makes, which is generally regarded as the greatest creation since the existence of molecules, and it's often not easy to pull them away from that childhood standard. In fact, it's often a waste of time. Before I tell you a little history of this, because there's not a lot to talk about, but it's sort of interesting, here's the list of ingredients for the traditional Andalusian gazpacho, according to the legendary Spanish chef and TV personality Carlos Arguiñano. Half a kilo of ripe tomato, half a green pepper, a clove of garlic, half a cucumber, 1 tablespoon of olive oil, 4 tablespoons of wine vinegar, 1 slice of bread. If you don't have French bread, use one from a standard loaf, and some salt. Then you basically throw them all together into a food processor and press the button. Another popular choice instructs us to include the following: a kilo of ripe tomatoes, 1 green pepper, 1 cucumber, cloves of garlic, they don't quite specify there, which can be dangerous, 3 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, 3 tablespoons of white wine vinegar, and 1 teaspoon of salt, which sounds like not enough for a soup that large. You might want to adjust to personal taste. But anyway, as you can tell, even at the most fundamental level, the recipes diverge. There are variables that shift the flavor and texture this way and that, and what may seem like small differences to the foreign mouth, nose, and taste buds can provoke highly vocal debates among the native Spanish. Let's start with bread. Now, it's been brought to my attention that Gazpacho Andaluz should never use a slice of bread. Some even treat its inclusion as something bordering on heresy and just a plain sign of ignorance. The above-mentioned recipes offer conflicting opinions and little insight into the matter. No one seems to agree. Another famous Spanish chef, Alberto Chicote, who stars in a restaurant rescue reality show similar to Chef Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares, can be seen with his mother on a program lightly bantering about different tricks to make a better gazpacho. He includes bread in his mother wouldn't dream of doing it. Other arguments center on what spices and herbs to use, if at all. Some like to flick in a pinch of spearmint just before serving, and others always shake a dash or two of cumin. This spice comes from the seed of the cumin plant. It is a common condiment in Spanish cooking. But not everyone is thrilled about its presence. Opponents will affect a gangster-like voice when they state, "I don't know what you were thinking, but real gazpacho never has cumin." And another will say that they're Andalusian and will swear by his mother's grave that cumin is an integral part of the soup. In fact, he is willing to take it further and evoke her spirit in a seance if necessary to prove it. And then there are other factors. For example, no one disputes the inclusion of the cucumber in the original recipe. Some just wish it wasn't there at all. Not there, not anywhere. Now, I've always considered the cucumber to be a relatively low-key member of the gazpacho team, a vegetable whose flavor is so subtle. In my opinion, it serves mainly as a secondary actor, necessary to the general working of things, but not the star. I mean, after all, it's not as if we're tossing in a couple of lamb kidneys. However, to a not so insignificant number of Spaniards, it possesses an overwhelmingly powerful flavor and a repulsive one at that. The lowly cucumber is capable of stirring such extreme levels of contempt that most prepared brands offer versions with and without it, calling the latter the mild-flavored gazpacho. Scorn for the cucumber goes back a long way and seemingly knows no frontier, even in England, where it has all but been knighted. Half the sandwiches include cucumber. It also has its detractors. Samuel Johnson, the sole author of the first major dictionary of the English language, wrote in its definition with great wit and probably a bit of unprofessionalism that according to physicians, cucumbers should be well sliced and dressed with pepper and vinegar and then thrown out as good for nothing. Many Spaniards would agree. They would just as soon ensure it was genetically eradicated altogether from the planet for good. In short, vegicide. A number of these disputes and confusions and misconceptions about gazpacho can be explained when you start to poke around the history of the dish. You quickly learn some pretty startling things about its origins and its ingredients, the most striking being that the almighty tomato, the cornerstone of the modern version, actually turns out to be one of the last members to join the club, and quite possibly the last one. A lot of this has to do with the fact that it didn't even enter Europe till at least 1521, and that hardly a mention of it was included in association with gazpacho until the 19th century, meaning that for about 300 years it was essentially ignored. Before that, gazpacho was a different dish. I mean a very different dish. Word has it it entered the Iberian Peninsula at some time, possibly 2,000 years ago, by way of the Romans. The earliest and most primitive version was said to have been comprised of sort of mashed bread, garlic, water, maybe a little bit of vinegar, a combination of ingredients that sort of heavily suggest it was popular mainly among the humblest and poorest echelons of society. I mean, this was basically a mushy mess of rudimentary foodstuff consumed to help the individual subsist more than succeed. Just little more than that. So it wasn't very fancy stuff. But this also brings us to one very important revelation, and it's a big one, and that is bread was a part of this recipe basically from day one. The gazpacho purists who say nay to it are in for a shock of their lives when they discover that it's basically the only ingredient, besides maybe vinegar and garlic, to consistently appear throughout the ages, and it's the very one that they repudiate. And in many ways, this shouldn't surprise us because bread has been a staple part of the diet in the Mediterranean for as long as anyone can remember. It is said that 60% of the ancient Spaniards' diet intake of calories came through cereals and grains, excluding alcoholic derivatives, and that the bread guild was once so powerful that governors needed to ensure they contented the sector if they were to be successful as rulers in a region. Bakers, not so surprisingly, constituted a major lobby. Bread has been a chief component of many soup-like meals in Spain. La Mancha, for example, has its own dish known as gazpacho manchego. Now, if you ever see it on a menu, I highly recommend you try it. But be careful if you are expecting a refreshing salad shake. This is something very different. It's a thick stew served hot, and it's made from quail, rabbit, and other small game, seasoned with thyme, garlic, rosemary, and bay leaves, and completed with broken pieces of traditional flatbread from the eastern part of La Mancha, known as a torta. And the stew sort of simmers. Small bits of bread are added to the broth to give it more texture, not unlike the way you toss oyster crackers into a thick clam chowder or soup. Another classic from the middle of the country is the sopa castellana, Castilian soup, which is a garlic-based broth to which is added stale bread, generally lightly stale bread, or at least a bread that's thick enough to handle it, bits of cured ham, paprika, and a poached egg. It's also served piping hot and very popular in wintertime. Returning to chilled dishes, you have white gazpacho or ajo blanco, made from bread, crushed almonds, garlic, water, olive oil, and salt. I've made it from scratch, and trust me, it's a laborious task from shelling to mashing to mixing and serving, but it is outstanding. So, the famous traditional gazpacho is none other than another variety of a wide range of dishes that have evolved over the centuries. In this case, as more vegetables were added to the Andalusian version, it took on a resemblance to what we know today, but only in a vague way. Back in the 19th century, travelers and visitors described it as a bunch of chunky vegetables and bread soaked in cold water and vinegar. On paper, it's nothing to write home about, but it restored your strength and was cheap and nutritious and refreshing. Now, ironically, the first written account of the recipe was not to be found in a Spanish monastery or palace kitchen, but many, many miles away in a cookbook published in 1824 by a most unsuspecting author, Mary Randolph, an American. Randolph came from an affluent Virginia family and possessed the culture, education, and means to see her project through. She wrote the fascinating book called The Virginia Housewife, which was not so much a manual on how to be the perfect homemaker, but rather a bona fide recipe repository, and a pretty complete one at that. It is considered to be a landmark work in the American culinary arts. While most of the meals described are American in origin, she also threw in a handful of Spanish oddities like ropa vieja, olla podrida, and croquetas. Now, considering the book focuses on regional Southern cuisine, their appearance hardly makes any sense until you learn that Mary's sister lived for several years in Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which happens to be the home of a typical Spanish sherry called Manzanilla, in the province of Cádiz, and sent the instructions of her favorite foods back home to be added to the list. Gazpacha, it was called, with an A at the end, was also mentioned. Now here is Miss Randolph's recipe. She calls for putting some soft biscuit or toasted bread in the bottom of a salad bowl, put in a layer of sliced tomatoes with the skin taken off, which is what they do today, and another layer of sliced cucumbers, sprinkled with pepper, salt, and chopped onion. Do this until the bowl is full. Then you are to stew some tomatoes until they're soft, strain the juice, mix it in with some mustard, that would be probably an American contribution, and oil, and pour it over. Make it 2 hours before it is eaten. It is here that we see some of the basic ingredients that we still find today. Now, it was finally when they introduced the blender, the food processor, that all these ingredients were blended, liquefied into a fine liquid that led to the cold soup everyone is familiar with today. Even then, the dish continues to evolve and adapt to changing tastes and habits. New varieties pop up all the time, and other versions have become popular. For example, its cousin, called salmorejo, traditionally a mainstay in the city of Cordoba, has risen in popularity and even surpassed gazpacho as the soup of preference in many circles. These days, you'd be hard-pressed to find a restaurant which doesn't serve it, especially in the summer. Salmorejo generally uses just tomatoes, no cucumber or green pepper, and much more bread. Sometimes it's made so thick you can basically put a spoon in it and it will stand up. And once it's ready to be served, most people top it off by adding chopped boiled egg, diced cured ham, and a dab of extra virgin olive oil. Gazpacho has set off in another direction, becoming a sort of lighter form of this type of soup, which is probably why more people now remove the bread to help differentiate it from the salmorejo. More and more versions of gazpacho include a touch of fruit. They might add melon to it or strawberry, something like that, even apples. The acid from the fruit and the natural sweetness will also lighten and soften the sometimes bold garlic flavor. And the combination can be delicious. Anyway, I like all these versions. I love gazpacho, I love salmorejo, and all the others, especially when the weather gets sweltering. But that's sometimes when I lean a little bit towards the gazpacho. It's a little bit more refreshing, and it can really make a difference. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast by Brian Spain Domain. Please feel free to leave us any comments because we love the feedback. You can subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Amazon, and Castos, or if you wish to support Brian Spain Domain, we'd greatly appreciate it. We work very hard to provide you with the best information about Spain, Spanish history, and Spanish culture, including Spanish cuisine. You can do so by clicking on our PayPal donate button, or if you want to have access to absolutely all of our podcasts, and support us regularly, you can check us out on Patreon at the link provided below. Stay well, stay safe, and hasta pronto.